Hi, thank you for inviting me, John, to talk today. So this talk is a bit of a adaptation of one I was asked to deliver to the European Union in December. So it's nice to have the opportunity to sort of expand it a little bit. So what I'm going to talk about is exposure to, and I'm going to call it intimate partner violence mostly, because domestic violence includes violence to children, violence to parents from children, elder abuse, pet abuse and so forth. But I'm talking about violence between romantic partners. So intimate partner violence is a term we use in the psychology literature. Where you see domestic violence, it's normally from a more feminist perspective. And where you see intimate partner violence, it's often from a more sort of gender-neutral perspective. So I'll talk a little bit about prevalence. I'm going to talk about men and women because I don't really like research that only talks about one gender. So there's a lot of similarities, some differences. Talk about childhood, adulthood, and some implications. I was moving this around on the train down here, as I always do, so if it gets a bit chaotic in the middle, I'll apologise. It will come all right at the end. So, exposure to intimate partner violence is regarded as an adverse childhood experience. And I imagine anyone certainly working professionally has heard ACE. It's all over everywhere now. So this includes both witnessing, just being aware but not witnessing, or even just living in a home where partner violence occurs. And from a trauma perspective, witnessing, hearing about it, or living in that tense atmosphere after a violent event, even if you don't know it happened, is such that it can be precipitate post-traumatic stress disorder, and actually probably more likely because of its chronic nature. It's not an event, it's a whole series of events maybe throughout your childhood. We can see people developing complex PTSD. So, if you have ever done your ACE score, who's done your ACE score? Oh, well, I'll give you the whole list later and we can all do it. It's such fun. But the second one on the ACE score is, did your parents ever experience being pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them, been hit so hard they were injured, or had a mark? So this is our domestic. Do you know that your parents were using domestic violence? So I was asked to do a review and a talk for the European Union, and I was really keen to try and capture the evidence. Now, there's a lot of papers on this, so I thought the most pragmatic approach is to look at all the papers that systematically or meta-analytically review all the other research. So of that, I found 14 papers that reviewed the literature. Some had only, say, 7 papers in them, separate studies. Some had 85, 90 papers, so it's quite broad. So there's overlap in what they say, but many of the papers have slightly different focus. So between all of these review articles, we can get a good idea about overall what is the literature telling us about this. So we've got populations from right across from every continent. Oceania, I didn't even believe that was a continent, by the way. I was like, that's from Game of Thrones, but apparently it is a continent. I'm still staggered by that. And the things that we tend to look at is things like the sex of a violent parent, mum or dad, the sex of a child, is it different for boys or girls, and what's the outcome for children exposed. So first, collating all the information, what we find that boys and girls seem to be pretty similar in their exposure to domestic abuse. So across pretty much all the continents, all the countries in all these continents, including the made-up one, it seems to be similar exposure, some differences, but nothing really major. From a scientific point of view, this is troubling. So countries such as South Africa have got very, very high rates, but even places such as Austria, which we would see as a European North European country, high rates as well. So this is a problem. Obviously, it's not nice, but why is it a problem, like psychologically, other than it not being a nice thing for children? It's because childhood is a really vulnerable time for children. So infants show the very early signs of detecting threat about 3 to 4 months. But unlike adults, they actually we find they attend to threat faces a lot more, and they don't seem to be able to disengage, so they can't avoid that behaviour. So essentially, an infant is likely to be a passive recipient of something almost, I don't know if anyone's seen, what's that film where they make you watch the films? It'll come to me. Clockwork Orange, almost like that. So they're passively made to experience this, they can't disengage. Now, there's no research on the impact of domestic abuse on little babies, but we know that obviously they are exposed, and these are likely to be why it's particularly bad. As you get into older children, we know from lab studies that children exposed to violence have this heightened threat sensitivity. So they both report it themselves, and if you do lab studies, so you could show children, say, these faces randomly, and you could monitor their heart rate, skin conductance, you could look at their facial expression, see if they withdraw and so forth. You can see that children who have been exposed to violence have a heightened response to a threatening face, such as this one on the left. And then what we know is, at this period, this is where you can start having a threat bias. So you start seeing ambiguous faces as threatening. So your experience of your life so far has been, things happen quickly, things are dangerous, and best to err on the side of caution and a presumed threat until it's proven otherwise. And then once you get to the older children, we find by the time they're 8 to 12, children living in violent households have just consistently higher arousal levels. So if you think 0 is the most relaxed you've ever been, and 10 is fight or flight, 10 is a tiger is chasing you. Okay? When you get to 10, your frontal lobes shut down, your primitive evolutionary drives to preserve your life kick in. So you're not thinking now, you're reacting. So somebody who is having a consistently heightened physiological arousal, when we get a little bit stressed, that's because we started at 1 or a 2. When they get a little bit stressed, that's on top of the 5 they tick on. So they're at 7 or 8. At 7 or 8, you get into a point where you're actually not doing things that you want to do, not necessarily behaving in a way that's socially acceptable. So you will start seeing behavioural problems exacerbating here, and you start seeing more somatic complaints as well. You start seeing headaches, stomach aches, this type of thing as well. So not only is it not nice for children to be exposed, they're particularly vulnerable when they're young. And they're trapped, essentially, in a family environment. So what do we know about children who have been exposed? Well, we know they show more internalising behaviour, so withdrawn, depressed, anxious, and externalising behaviour, so aggression, kicking off, reckless behaviour and so forth. And this is found both by looking at children we know are in that situation, how they're behaving now, and also looking at people who were in that situation and how they're behaving later, even if they're not still in that situation. So there's some mixed results about whether boys or girls respond differently to this adverse child experience of being exposed to domestic abuse. So the study with the largest number of other studies, VU, in 2016, so that's the most complete data set we have, found no sex differences. So no differences between whether a child will externalise or internalise based on whether they're a boy or a girl. Some of the other papers found some studies. Some have found boys more likely to externalise, girls more likely to internalise. So, balance of probabilities, it's almost certainly that there isn't any consistent sex difference. But either way, whether you're being aggressive, kicking off and risk-taking, or you're being depressed, anxious and withdrawn, it is a symptom of the exposure that you've had. It's not bad behaviour in itself, it is a symptom of your exposure to violence. And this is where you see your complex trauma. Unlike PTSD, complex trauma is often not recognised. And the symptoms can take years to actually show. So after traumatising, so I live in the north, someone I know, my daughter's best friend, was waiting for her sister when the arena bombing went off, and I've seen close up exactly what PTSD looks like. 6 weeks later, still can't go to sleep until it's light and things like that. Clearly a PTSD symptom. Complex trauma is different. It often manifests itself in behaviours and mental health, and it takes time to build up. So this led me to think, and this is a think. So some of the things I know, so what I presented I know, some of the things I wonder, and this is one of the things I wonder. When you look at the diagnosis for ADHD, don't listen, can't learn, disorganised, distractible, hyperactive, restless, difficulties, these are all symptoms of complex trauma. So from a psychological perspective, if I had a client presenting with these, I would say, this is looking like complex trauma, maybe we should do an assessment. And indeed, if you look at the trauma ADHD literature, there is an overlap. You can't really see that, unfortunately, but essentially, these core features, all my family are teachers, and these are the things that get kids diagnosed. These things about distractible, won't let others learn, doesn't listen, disorganised, hyperactive, restless, and so forth. So it makes you wonder whether ADHD is actually complex trauma in poor children. That's what I wonder. And it won't be 100%, but how much of it is actually complex trauma? Because if you're not poor, if you've got resources, then you can pay for therapy for your children. If you're not, you get medication. So what do we know about ADHD? Well, apparently in the UK, Ford did a study. I was trying to look for prevalence, and it appears that boys are 5 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed with ADHD. So boys are getting this label far, far more frequently than girls. And complex PTSD, ADHD looks like complex PTSD, in the fact it's got all these comorbid psychiatric conditions, depression, anxiety, and so forth. What's interesting is compared with male individuals with ADHD, women, girls who showed, girls who were diagnosed as ADHD were more likely to have autism, spectrum disorder, oppositional defiant conduct disorder, intellectual disability, personality disorder, schizophrenia, substance use disorder, suicidal behaviour. So the authors say this better work the right way. Yeah. This study indicates that female individuals diagnosed with ADHD are a more vulnerable group of patients. What's the alternative explanation? Does anyone have an alternative interpretation there? Shout it out. It only came to me and Deb's on the train, so. No thoughts? Mm-hmm.
The difference is that when you're talking about the reptilian brain kicking off, what can happen with a difficult birth, what can happen with a C-section, forceps delivery, the same thing can happen. That little part of our brain that's visible 22 days after we're conceived, that helps us to survive in the womb, can actually stay on, and if it does, it produces exactly what's.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is why do girls with ADHD have significantly more of these conditions than boys? It's interpreted in the literature as saying the study indicates females diagnosed with ADHD are more vulnerable. My own interpretation is a question mark, or is it that males are diagnosed at a lower threshold? Are we diagnosing boys' behaviour, normal behaviour for boys, and maybe normal behaviour for boys brought up in quite difficult situations, maybe traumatised normal boys? Are we just giving them a label pretty quickly? Really interestingly, a paper by Molam this year says that if you look at diagnosis and referrals for diagnosis, that female caregivers and female teachers, we only asked teachers, looked at mums and teachers, are far more likely to say a boy is needing ADHD medication diagnosis. Dads and male teachers don't. So there is a systematic bias with women saying that boys' behaviour is more ADHD than men say. So that makes me then think, I work with domestic violence men and women, mainly men, because that's who gets referred. They're always telling me, I walk into a room and I've got 5 social workers. All women, all women. So essentially, with our low socioeconomic group of boys who are our ADHD boys, are they not completely brought up by women, educated by women? Is that not a thing? I think it is. I've read it even in The Guardian, for goodness sake. I'll just put it out there.
So can I just say I'm an educational child psychologist, so my whole life.
Yeah, this is my own. Mine's the best.
I want to support what you're saying. So I work with 2-year-olds up to 25-year-olds, and I'm in schools and homes and children's homes all the time as my job, and I absolutely strongly agree with what you're saying. I really, there's a real lack of tolerance about what it is to be a boy. And even this week, in the last 7 days, in professional meetings, where I'm often usually only a man, and that's fine, I'm used to that. I hear the women professionals say, well, what do you expect? He's only a boy. These are teachers. Not the majority don't, but it's still there.
And they think they can say it.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
And what do you expect? Or it's typical as a boy, as if that's a kind of just acceptance of it, and I overhear it in cafes and still.
Yeah.
And that's this week that's happened.
It's shocking.
So I would agree about the lower threshold. I mean, it's a complicated issue.
It is.
It's not straightforward, but I really strongly agree with that.
And it's a bit of a catch-all.
Yeah. Huge concerns about it.
And I know with my clients that almost all, just about every family I ever have any in contact with the perpetrator, the kids will be ADHD in the family. So it is just very working class.
Just last thing, the curriculum within schools as well is upped. So
I've got 4 girls, right, and they want to shoot themselves.
Really
but girls can sit still, can't they? They can just sit there, and boys can't. Boys are like puppies.
These are 3 and 4-year-old boys that we're talking about. Oh. So it's really
we'll talk a little.
Yeah.
Can I just add that one of the things is I worked in camps for 30 years before I retired last year. This is an enormously complex issue. There are very, very few child psychiatrists who have been trained to look at PTSD. So ADHD is always the default. The other thing is that a great many parents from deprived backgrounds come to clinics looking for the ADHD diagnosis so that they can get benefits, additional care for the children. It's a very, very corrupt system that protects the very thing that you're saying, that we're trying to understand.
Well, and in addition, the medication, when taken by someone who isn't ADHD, is actually amphetamines, isn't it?
Well, it's also effectively off license. They shouldn't be prescribed.
Right, quickly.
Did you find a good difference in whether children become introverted, withdrawn, depressed, or whether they extrovert out touch? So I'm just thinking that the depressed, introverted child that withdraws is likely to be overlooked, not medicated.
Yeah, I mean, the ADHD seems to be the one to be the squeaky wheel, isn't it? Yeah.
But
often they're depressed as well anyway, it should be also.
Was there a difference in whether they went, which way they went?
I don't know, I'd have to look at that. But it sounds like we've got some experts in the room, so we can take their brains and questions. Right, so I wonder whether complex trauma explains the relationship between ADHD and all these problematic outcomes, because it's related to offending, substance use, mental health, personality disorder. But hey, so adverse childhood experiences. And adverse childhood experiences are a trauma model. That's how I'm looking at it. And indeed, if we are misdiagnosing, then, well, medication is the most widely used ADHD treatment. The evidence for that, for traumatic stress, is not there. So not only are we not meeting their needs, it's like we are essentially sedating people until they get old enough to stop taking medication and then self-medicate with strong skunk and things like that, which is what I see in Manchester. Yeah, so a question I pose for us to ponder in our mind is, so are boys medicated rather than helped? More than girls. Like, girls also have this too. I'm just saying there seems to be a bit of a... it seems that when you look at what boys and girls need, they need the same things. So the things that protect boys and girls are pretty much the same. If there are any sex differences, it seems probably counterintuitively, for girls, educational attainment seems to be protective, and for boys, having self-esteem. There's this terror about men having self-esteem, isn't it? Being big men full of themselves. Actually, that's what it seems that men... Maybe that will protect boys. Maybe we should be giving boys self-esteem help rather than just girls. So it seems like a digression. So let's go back to domestic violence. If we're talking about exposure to domestic violence, it's still men's fault though, because domestic violence is men hitting women. Women, isn't it? Well, yes, according to the World Health Organization, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, brackets, violence against women. Don't forget the message. At all points, domestic violence is violence against women. And this is pervasive. When I was in the EU, an academic from Sweden, Joachim Soers, did a systematic review of exposure to domestic violence across all these continents and found that victimisation is pretty much the same, male and female, even in Africa, Asia. I've got research from... where's that gone? That was strange. Perpetration, pretty similar for men and women across all these places. Victimisation, similar again. So domestic violence isn't just men hitting women. Domestic violence is equally likely to be a woman hitting a man. And indeed, about 50% of domestic abuse is mutual violence, both parents using aggression. And children with mutually violent parents are the most damaged children of all of them. What we know is exposure to your parents' violence is a robust risk factor for using partner violence in the future. It increases the odds by over 4 times, and there's no significant difference whether you see dad hitting mum or mum hitting dad. There is no significant difference if you are a male child being exposed or a female child. There is no interaction between a man seeing his dad hit his mum versus a boy seeing his dad his mum hit his dad, or vice versa with the girl. Parental exposure is a risk factor for adult victimisation for boys and girls. So I'd like to, this is from the feminist website, I love it. Stop the misrepresentation of women in our media. As a woman, let's stop this now. So when we talk about ACEs, that's the ACE scale, so we could all do it. We probably won't have time, so we won't today. But a lot of the ACE questionnaires, this is one I think that's used in Scotland, actually, for their question on domestic violence, doesn't ask about parents, it asks about mother or stepmother. The European Union, I think only one nation across Europe actually included the gender-neutral term. And it's one of the Eastern European countries, which is interesting. So the media systematically tries to take hold of this and frame it as a male violence to women issue. And it's more subtle than this. I've been at this so many years now, I'm hypersensitive to it, like somebody who needs an EpiPen when we get stung with a bee. I almost need an EpiPen when I read anything online now. So it's subtle. So I was looking at the Wales ACE study. So the Wales ACE study, right, interesting study, well done, good on them. But little things like this. So higher rates of violence victimisation were recorded for males. This is tiny, there's nothing said about this, just in there. Brackets, 13.7% males, 4.5% females. Some men are more likely to be victims of violence. Didn't see that on any bullet-pointed exact list. Next, just underneath it, the prevalence of violence perpetration reported by males was significantly higher than females. Right? That's a different statement, isn't it, to this one. High rates of violence, victimisation were recorded for males. Prevalence rates of perpetration reported by males was significantly higher than females. Now, if you look at the figures, which one's more different? The victimisation rates. That's a larger effect size. And this it seems little. I checked it, by the way. I went online and put the percentages and the sample size in because I'm a nerd. And then we go to a big data table. So anyone who knows about ACEs knows that all ACEs are bad, but 4 or more seems to be a cut-off for bad outcomes, statistically. So if we whiz along here, I don't know if you can see it here. So males, 4 or more ACEs. Who has 4 or more ACEs? Males or females? Males. So males are far more likely to be at this really problematic, let's get involved society position, yeah? And that's not a little effect, 15.5 to 12. That's quite a big effect. That's a sizable difference. And if we look at this, look, ACEs, 4 times with 4 or more ACEs, look at all these things here. right? And do you know what isn't said? Every single one of them in that report, men are more likely to have. Every single one of those factors are significantly more likely for men. What do they say? Just have a read of this yourself on the side. This is their summary of their evidence. Does it even make sense? Have they read the same report as me? This is what I'm talking. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you already know this. It's everywhere. It is just shocking. It's irritating. Royal College of Psychiatrists. Domestic violence and abuse impact on children and adolescents. As adults, children who have witnessed violence and abuse are more likely to become involved in a violent and abusive relationship. That is true. Children tend to copy the behaviour of their parents. Boys learn from their fathers to be violent to women. Girls learn from their mothers that violence is to be expected and something you just have to put up with. Women's aid. The cycle of violence, otherwise, a boy who witnessed domestic abuse does not have to go up to the abuser, and a girl who does not have to become a victim of domestic abuse. UNICEF. Come on. There is a strong likelihood intergenerational. Finding rates of abuse are higher among women than husbands who were abused as children or saw their mothers abused. So rates of abuse are higher for women. Just completely annoying. And this is... sorry, I like getting annoyed, it's fun. And this is from the academic literature. Most experts believe that children who are raised in violent homes learn it's an effective way to resolve conflicts and problems, and they replicate the violence they've witnessed. So boys batter their female partners as adults. Girls believe that the threats of violence are the norm in relationships. Social work. Normally, somewhere I wouldn't look for support in a gender-neutral position, but good on this paper. It was found that those students reporting four or more ACEs was the best predictor of more ACEs. The pattern holds true reporting for female-directed domestic violence or male. So this is social work journal actually saying it doesn't matter if it's women or men using violence. So this matters because of how we respond to witnessing. So a girl is like, you poor thing, let's stop you being a victim. And a boy, who should be seen as a victim, is seen as, oh, potential abuser. Like, let's almost get him locked up and sedated now, because if we don't, he's going to go and hurt women when he grows up. This is one from my local. I live in Overston, a tiny town in Cumbria, and this was one of the ones. Bride to be smashed wine glass in fiance's face after she accused him of sexting women. So police arrived at the scene, found two teenage boys huddled together. The judge said, you punched him in the face, then hit him with a glass, cut him. People who do this must always expect a custodial sentence. However, it was out of character. She had common assault in her past. It's not out of character. You were generally remorseful. She cried. Your partner doesn't want you to be punished. Guys don't. You won't press charges. You have responsibility for 4 children as a mum. As a mum, you're a good mum. You beat your husband and cut him with a glass in front of your children. So they gave him probation. And the judge wished her the best for the future. This is how it plays out, not only on how boys feel about it, how we all talk about being where money goes, but day to day in little cases like this. So exposure to parental partner violence is an adverse childhood experience. It is not a learning opportunity. Boys don't learn to be perps and girls don't learn to be victims. It's an adverse childhood experience. That's why ACEs are related to, these are your scores, partner violence, yes. And you could say, okay, that's people seeing it and replicating it. Then why would it explain why it's related to quality of life? Why is it related to chronic depression? Why is it related to psychosis, smoking, alcoholism, illicit drugs, prescription use, suicide attempts, homelessness, why having sex earlier, length of your life, type 2 diabetes. Is this all learned? Am I learning to be diabetic because I saw violence? Or am I traumatised? Essentially, the more ACEs you get, the sooner you die, and that is not something I'm learning. That is something that is a physiological, biochemical response to a stressful environment, which there is a wealth of literature explaining it. Learning theory applied like this, and it is being applied like this in domestic abuse across the country to keep men as the perps and culpable and women as the victims. So, we know if you've seen intimate partner violence between your caregivers, it's a big flag for other ACEs. And the more ACEs you have, the worse things are. ACEs go in clusters. So if you see domestic violence, that's where you should be going in and taking an evidence-based approach to it. We've got an opportunity now to move forward and start addressing social problems, society's problems, by treating men and women as people first, and addressing their experiences in a way that may actually help move us forward as a community. So the implications are, it's damaging across multiple domains. It's one of the most common exposure is. Boys and girls are both affected pretty similarly, which is inconsistent with pretty much everywhere in the world on what they say about these things. No studies only ask about mums being violent to dads, but many studies only ask about mum being a victim. But there's no difference. So to ignore women's perpetration is to deny the boys and girls who are experiencing that. And this is how I finished my review to the EU. So the review suggests boys and girls are similarly harmed by exposure, whether it's from a violent mum or a violent dad. Peer-reviewed literature provides no support for a gender perspective when targeting intimate partner violence, as children are adversely affected regardless of whether the violence is fathers, mothers or both. The failure to target women's use of intimate partner violence in the same way as men's has no obvious empirical support and should be urgently re-evaluated in order to fully understand and intervene effectively. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Is there anything you can say about violence within same-sex relationships?
I can talk of that. Yeah. So if you're talking, what I know about that is prevalence rates. So if you're looking at who's more likely to have violence, so the most violent relationships from self-report are lesbian relationships. And then sometimes it's same-sex male homosexual, and sometimes it's heterosexual. But yeah, it seems that lesbian relationships are the most violent of relationships. And that sort of figures in the fact that when you look in the UK and Europe, which is where this research on same-sex is done, women are more violent in heterosexual relationships as well. So they are. I mean, that's across all the northern, like Europe, Northern Europe, women are more violent than men. What we find is Liz here. Liz Ray? Not yet. Cool. Liz will know this, but what we find is when men actually reduce their violence when they're arguing with a woman versus a man, whereas women increase their violence when arguing with a man versus a woman. And as societal protection of women equality, as women become more equal in society, then men's violence goes down and women's violence goes up. So essentially, women don't like being hurt or injured. We have biological and a bit of an evolutionary psychology. There's a biological reason why women who were reckless didn't have babies or didn't bring them up, their genes died out. Women are more afraid of blood, large mammals, disease, everything. Hospitals are full of women in waiting rooms. We're just more cautious generally. So when we're violent against people who aren't going to harm us. So we are more violent towards children, elderly, disabled people, and our male partners in Western nations, because if they hit you back, you're going to get them done. So, women.
Just, I have to say, very refreshing. I really love what that's presenting, because one of the things that we're trying to establish in Ireland is this kind of information to be put out. Again, as I say, we do want to have a situation that it has to be an us relationship.
Yeah.
You can't have this them and us. And the women's movements, some of them, are so pushing an anti-man agenda that men are afraid. And actually, to the situation now in Ireland, that men they're not even want to get married. They just don't want to. So that's one part. And then, of course, women want to have children, and they are waiting and waiting and waiting, and they're waiting very long, and then that creates more complications. So it's this is a pressure, and the thing is getting it out.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And the thing is, it's not just men who are chilled into not saying this, women are. Debs and I were talking about this. Liz was saying the same. Many women here working in this area. Oh, Leslie, hi! You know, our only protection is with women. So that really irritates them, because if a man said what we said, they would be attacked. But I've seen bullying from very, very eminent professors, female professors, to junior academic staff. They don't bother with me because I'm like gobby. What they do, if they target them like mean girls in the school, it's shocking.
Exactly. Well,
so it's not women's movement, it's that you're either on their message or you're wrong.
It's very interesting that you talk about the academic side. I mean, I think I get quite a number of clients from the universities where this comes, but men and women being bullied by the next one up.
Yeah.
You know, you hadn't the right degree, or your degree wasn't good enough, and the kind of bullying that goes on within universities is even worse.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We all can use all the fancy words as well to dress it up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We have another. You had a question there.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say thank you for a really brilliant talk. I was wondering, you know, when you spoke about maybe the misdiagnosis of ADHD and maybe it's actually complex trauma, do you think that might be related to the gender differences when we see kind of women predominantly in PD services, and then you've got a high number of men in the forensic services?
Yeah.
And there might be misdiagnosis there as well.
Yeah, I mean, you see some great comments. I got them. I was reading on the phone, just annoying myself really. And they say things like, you know, women shouldn't be diagnosed PD. If you're a female prisoner with PD, you should be let out. You shouldn't be in prison. It's like, oh my God, it should be like the guys out there. And that's like 75% have got one or more personality disorder. But women are diverted. So if you look at the research, if police turn up to an incident, the woman is more likely to not have nothing happen to her at all, statistically, right? So the guy gets arrested, the woman doesn't. So at the next stage, obviously some women do get arrested, but the next stage, when we get to the cell, women are statistically more likely to not be charged and just released. Men get charged. Then it goes up to a CPS. So at this stage, so the remaining women are still there, they're filtering off all along, so you've still got women now. CPS, more likely to say not in public interest for women, dismiss that, take the guys to court. So now you've got all the guys mainly, a lot of these guys are still there, a lot of the women have been filtered out. So you're getting the probably most complicated, dangerous women sort of working it up. Get to court, more likely to get discharged for women, more likely to get convicted for men with a custodial sentence. If you get a custodial sentence, then you get a longer one than women, and so forth. So you filter out the women all along. We show chivalry to women all along with that case there. And then, this is what really winds me up, and I explain this to police now when I meet them. Then we say, but female prisoners are different because they're the most complex and vulnerable because they have all this abuse history and so forth, as do men. The reason that we have very complex female offenders is we weed out every woman, apart from those really complicated cases, who are so belligerent at scene, you know, so dangerous, so prolific. And then we use that as an excuse to say women shouldn't be in prison. It's like, well, actually, men shouldn't be in prison either, because every argument you use against men being in prison with women, like, it doesn't, I was reading it today in the BBC, it doesn't work for women, you've got mental health needs, and it all goes for men as well. But within the male estate, you've got a lot of men who are really quite low risk. Yeah, I've gone through files. I've had research where I've done 3 months looking through files. I mean, one guy was in prison for like a year for buying pop for his friends and like distributing it. He went down for the thingy, and they said, well, we won't give him any rehabilitation because he's got no risk. You know. So women are diverted to mental health and support networks, and men are just filtered into the criminal justice system.
That's for that. We were chatting about this on the train. We were saying that the whole attitude, if you take it from day dot and you look at how who are the main influences in children's lives, and we still expect women to be the primary caregiver, and then we filter children into primary schools that are predominantly women, and we have this attitude, that men equals perpetrator, woman equals victim. So the idea that we would expect adult women to take any kind of action that involves responsibility or self-development or anything that would change their behaviour is difficult on a number of aspects, but mainly because they need to recognise that they are not the victim. In a lot of these cases, they are the perpetrator. But we were saying that the idea that in the forensic community, female prisoners are disordered is baffling that they wouldn't be, considering that for the entirety of their lives, they've not been held accountable. So we breed this, and then we expect it to disappear. Why wouldn't we expect it to get to a point where, forensically, those that are actually in prison are so vulnerable or disordered because we've bred it? At no point have we asked them to take responsibility for their behaviour.
Indeed, I examined a PhD at the University of Birmingham, a nice prestigious Russell Group university. The person worked within the criminal justice system, and they interviewed male murderers of their partners and females, and the men were like, well, it's lip service, I take responsibility, they were like really hammering that in. But women said literally terms like, I feel like it's been an important learning experience for me. I feel that I've really grown from this experience, literally. And in the Bible, it hadn't been picked up. I was saying to this person who's experienced, like, working with prisoners, I said, do you not think there's a bit of a difference? She's like, in what way? I was like, huh. But women are saying, like, this has been really good for me, like killing my partner, and she just hadn't picked up on it, and she was like, huh. So even though she was doing a project on women using violence, so she's ahead of the curve for national offender management sort of area, she's like, brilliant, well done. She couldn't see this obvious thing. And it's what I've got daughters, and the thing I say to them is, it's like, if you think the world's at fault, you are going to have a very unhappy life because you can't change the world. If you take responsibility for your own well-being and those around you, and like try and do something for yourself, then you can change yourself. That's probably the only way forward. That's why women are so unhappy. That's why we're all on antidepressants, probably.
Nicola, I want to thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you.